former Statistician-General Dr. Pali Lehohla says the current ANC is not what the party's veterans would have imagined it to be. He was speaking at the 16th Chief Albert Luthuli Memorial Lecture that was delivered at the University of KwaZulu-Natal on Saturday. He says the party needs renewal as it approaches the 55th elective conference this month. Lehohla also says it's concerning that a number of ANC officials are accused of various kinds of corruption. For more on his thoughts and perhaps an idea of what the way forward looks like as we count down to this conference, let's bring in Dr. Lehohla, who joins us via our video link this afternoon. Great to have you on the program, sir. Thank you so much indeed for speaking to us. And in that lecture, you took a very interesting decision by essentially using a metaphor where South Africa is likened to a widow in this country. Help us understand the kind of message you are hoping to send through there.
Well, I think the metaphor came out of what I observed of particularly the widow of Chief Albert Luthuli as a leader, the widow of Martin Luther King as a leader, and many other widows such as Albertina Sisulu as a leader, such as Epitinas Mbeki as a leader, as a widow of a leader. So is Winnie Mandela as a leader, as a widow of Nelson Mandela, and of course Graça Machel as a widow of both Machel and President Mandela. So is Ntiki Biko. Now, the question that one wants to say is, in the context of what we call widow South Africa, is this widow resembling these widows I've talked about? There could be a widow who resigns herself to saying, my husband is dead, and that's the end of the world. I don't have to do anything except to mourn my husband who is dead. And my poverty affirms the departure of this great man, which I call African succession plan, that once a big man is gone, then no one else replaces or continues the legacy of an African big person, lest you then overshadow his greatness, as I said. So, and then there is a widow who is actually one who is reckless, promiscuous, if one were to say, who sells family jewels over a plate of curry or over a few shekels, and then finally gets impoverished and, in fact, runs mad. Now, when we look at South Africa, the widow, we are in that space of this other widow, not the one who resigns to poverty as a symbol of mourning the great husband who has passed, and then in poverty this widow mourns perpetually the husband. There is the widow of Mama Nokanya, the widow of Albert Luthuli, which is the lecture I was having, who actually took the baton, ran with it, mobilized women in Grootville, and continued the legacy of Albert Luthuli until she died. And there are many other widows that are still alive who are doing that, continuing with the legacy of fighting for freedom. The South Africa we have is the widow who is promiscuous and throwing shekels around to show her riches as though there is no end in life. And that's what we see in this present ANC.
Sure.
It has actually desecrated the graves of Nelson Mandela. And some of us actually say that these people sold out. Now, who in their right mind would actually say that? When people have spent 27 years, others died, others, their lives destroyed, their families destroyed, would actually do that only to sell out in the end?
Fascinating imagery.
It is an improper thinking, completely improper thinking.
As you continue speaking, because part of what was said in that lecture is you calling on this ANC, which I imagine is the widow in this scenario, to come back to itself by renewing itself come the 55th elective conference. But if the party's own legacy is anything to go by, at least in recent years, many people might be thinking that perhaps you're being naive to think that anything would change, especially when you also see how the past week has fared when it comes to the leadership contest in the governing party.
Well, that's why I kept on saying the ANC of Albert Luthuli. That's the ANC that the ANC should rise up to. This one that we have is not the ANC of Albert Luthuli. And indeed, I might be quite naive to imagine that on the eve of the wedding, where the groom and the bride are at loggerheads and the in-laws are fighting and the ox has just bolted for the slaughter of the wedding, to imagine that there will be a wedding, yes, it would be naive, and I think I'm certainly being deliberately naive, awakening us that we are on a cliff, and the ANC is on a cliff, and the spirit of Luthuli, the ANC of Luthuli, cannot be accommodated in this dilapidated shack that is called the ANC today.
Sure. Let's stay with that imagery of the cliff then. There are people who believe that if the ANC falls over that cliff, the country is going down with them. What's your take on that?
Oh, indeed, it will. The country has already gone over the cliff itself. So it's just the last kick that it will do so. So it is understanding what needs to be done, and that's the point I want to come to, and I want to make an example. You know, when the resolutions of South Africa's problems were coming and Mandela was released and so on, I was in Bophuthatswana myself. And my concern and my concentration was, what would a post-apartheid statistics system look like? I was waiting for a homeland. But I surrounded myself with two people, Professor John Kaimbara and Professor Geya, to think through this problem. And then we went and saw Professor Mokgoro and said, look, we have this problem and we need to resolve it. So that South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, should have a particular way that it looks. It doesn't come as a surprise that in my tenure, let's say 17 years later, we achieved that vision, that we had that institution, one of the only ones standing throughout. Now, we need a process of thinking that way, of what does a post-period South Africa look like after the crash, which is here now, we are facing. I don't know whether people are gathering in that kind of way to think about that moment. I also penned what happens when the lights are off. Obviously, 6 months ago, Minister Pravin Gordhan said, no, the lights cannot go off. I mean, level 2 is very far from level 6 or level 8. Now we are at level 6, which is very close to level 8, and he's saying, well, I've told the board and the management to solve this. These things are not things that you solve by exhortation. You solve them by showing a plan. And indeed, all along, there's not been a plan. Even the just transition doesn't have a plan. So when we don't have and we don't take seriously the question of planning, we end up with things like this. Now, we need fellow South Africans to sit and think plan and say, how are we going to plod our way out of this in the next 15 years? Because this scandalous situation is not going to take us less than 15 years to get out of. And it's still going to get worse. So this lecture is about raising the ANC of Albert Luthuli. And that spirit of that ANC to be the one that we aspire for. This one that is going to fight over an election over the weekend, it's a doomed wedding. the ox has bolted. It's nowhere to be found for slaughter. The groom and the bride are in different cities.
Sure.
And the priest is not there.
And I suppose the guests are wondering what happens next. But what's your response to people who are asking questions about whether or not, as opposed to idealizing the ANC of Chief Albert Luthuli, we should start reimagining a completely different system, that doesn't necessarily have attachments to any kind of ANC. I mean, there are people who've come forward to say, actually, there's nothing spectacular happening here. Like any other organization that's been around for years, the ANC is dying a natural death, albeit a death that might, leave South Africa itself with several bruises. But nonetheless, these are just the last kicks of a dying horse, and we expected it not to be smooth. It's important for us, nonetheless, to think about what the country looks like outside of any kind of attachment to any ANC.
No. We cannot ignore those things that stood out in our culture, in our struggle. That will be desecrating everything else, and we'll never achieve anything in our lives. So, Chief Albert Luthuli and those around him, Steve Biko and those around him, Sobukwe and those around him, stood for something, and they cannot be seen outside those structures that created them. So, we cannot do that. If we do that, then we alienate ourselves from our roots, our history. What the current people in the ANC have done is deplorable. It cannot be what Mandela stood for or Chief Albert Luthuli stood for. Absolutely not. So the spirit of revolution and change is captured in those, and it cannot be removed from them. And we cannot say there was no ANC. That would be very wrong. Because then we will not have a country called South Africa. Because if we separate ourselves from that, I mean, what is happening now, if you look at ESCOM, it will be 100 years next year, and nobody is talking about how do we celebrate ESCOM, which is now becoming 100 years. Little do we say, how do we celebrate the ANC, which is now 110 years, which will be 111 years next year. And this is the question that President Mbeki asked in 2007 and Polokwane, where he said, how do we celebrate? How do we remember? How do we appreciate those who paid through limb and life for the freedom that we have? So anyone who says we should forget that one is wrong, because they will face the same demise of spitting on history. And it will judge us very harshly.
On that provocative note, we'll have to leave it. Dr. Pali Lehohla, always great speaking to you, sir. Of course, the speech was much longer where you touch on various other things, but given the kind of weekend coming ahead, I imagine we'll have time to ventilate those issues. But for now, thanks very much indeed. Dr. Pali Lehohla is a former Statistician-General at Statistics South Africa, speaking to us there about some of his thoughts, some of them ventilated as he was delivering the 16th Chief Albert Luthuli Memorial Lecture this weekend.